He had legions, treasuries, and the loyalty, or at least the obedience, of 60 million people, and most nights, after the frontier campaigns and the plague reports and the endless administration of an empire under siege, Marcus Aurelius sat down and wrote a letter to nobody but himself. He never intended for anyone to read it. There was no audience, no publication plan, no legacy strategy. Just a private nightly habit of checking his own thinking against his own standards. It's one of the strangest facts in history. The most powerful man alive spent his evenings holding himself accountable to a version of himself nobody else could see. Think about that for a moment. Every other record from his reign was written for someone. The imperial edicts were written for the Senate. The military dispatches were written for his generals. The coinage was struck for the public. Everything Marcus Aurelius produced in daylight was performance, because everything a Roman emperor did in daylight was watched. But at night, alone, in a tent on the Danube frontier or in a palace room in Rome, he wrote for an audience of one. And that's exactly why what he wrote survived as something worth reading 2,000 years later. Not because it was eloquent, not because it was original, but because it was honest in a way almost nothing else from antiquity is honest. We're going to look at what that habit actually was, what it cost him to keep it, and why the discipline behind it matters more today than it did then. Because most of us will never rule an empire, but all of us are already performing for an audience all the time, even when we think no one's watching. Lesson 1. The audience-free habit is the honest one. The moment you write for an audience, even a private one you imagine reading it later, the words start performing. Marcus Aurelius's notes worked precisely because no one was ever supposed to see them, which means what's in there is the closest thing we have to what he actually believed, not what he wanted history to think he believed. This is worth sitting with because it cuts against almost everything we're taught about self-improvement today. We're told to write down our goals so we can share them, journal so we can look back and see our growth, document the process so it becomes content. Every modern habit of reflection has an audience baked into it somewhere, even if that audience is just a future version of yourself performing for a present version of yourself. Marcus Aurelius didn't have that problem because he genuinely believed no one would ever read what he wrote. Historians still argue about the working title. Some sources call it ta eis heauton, which translates roughly to things to himself, not things for history, not things for my son, things to himself. The addressee and the reader were the same person, and that person was never going to publish it, quote it, or use it to build a reputation. Compare that to a man an ocean and 17 centuries away who understood the exact same principle from the opposite direction. The Duke of Wellington, in the years after Waterloo, was notorious for writing an almost inhuman volume of private correspondence and memoranda, sometimes dozens of letters in a single evening, covering everything from troop rations to horse breeding to the precise wording of a reprimand. Most of it was never meant to flatter anyone, least of all himself. It was blunt, procedural, and often savagely self-critical about his own errors in a campaign. Wellington's biographers have noted that his private notes on his own mistakes at Assaye and later in the Peninsula are far harsher than anything his enemies ever said about him in public. He wasn't writing for glory. He was writing to correct himself before the next decision, in private, where no one could see him do it. This is the stiff upper lip in its original unglamorous form, not a performance of composure for other people to admire, but a private correction of the self, undertaken specifically where no one was watching. Long before "keep calm and carry on" became a printed slogan, it was already a practiced habit in rooms like Wellington's study. The belief that whatever you felt about your own failures, you dealt with it on paper, alone, and carried on regardless the next morning. That's the pattern. The people history remembers as disciplined weren't performing discipline for spectators. They were quietly holding themselves to account in rooms with no one else in them. The habit only works if it's honest, and it's only honest if there's no one to impress, including your future self. Here's the uncomfortable follow-on question. How much of what you currently call reflection is actually self-accountability? And how much of it is a performance for an audience of one that you've quietly built into your own head? If you journal knowing you might reread it later and feel proud, that's not quite the same as writing something you'd be ashamed to have anyone, even future you, ever find flattering. Lesson 2. Repetition is the point, not the failure. Many entries in meditations repeat the same ideas. Control what's yours, expect difficulty, remember mortality, over and over in different words. That's not Marcus Aurelius forgetting his own lessons. It's proof that even someone who wrote the ideas down still needed to rehear them constantly. Wisdom isn't a fact you learn once. It's a discipline you repractice, some days successfully, some days not. Consider the conditions under which these repeated notes were actually written. Marcus Aurelius spent a significant portion of his reign not in the marble comfort of Rome, but on the Danube frontier, commanding legions against the Marcomanni and the Quadi in a war that dragged on, with interruptions, for over a decade. During that same stretch, the Antonine Plague, likely smallpox or measles brought back by returning soldiers from the eastern campaigns, killed by some ancient estimates as much as a tenth of the empire's population. Marcus Aurelius was administering a war and a pandemic simultaneously from a tent while writing to himself at night about the importance of accepting what he could not control. And he had to write it again and again, not because the insight was wrong the first time, but because a bad night's sleep, a fresh report of plague dead, or a betrayal by an officer he trusted could undo the lesson by morning. The notebook wasn't a monument to wisdom already achieved. It was a maintenance log for a mind under constant siege from circumstance. There's a very British parallel to this, and it's not the one people usually reach for. Everyone knows the phrase, "keep calm and carry on." But almost no one asks why a government would need to print that phrase on a poster in the first place. You don't manufacture a slogan to remind people of something they already do effortlessly. The poster existed because staying calm under bombardment wasn't a personality trait the British public simply had. It was a discipline that had to be manufactured, repeated, and reinforced. Poster after poster, broadcast after broadcast, because the alternative was panic, and panic was operationally dangerous during the Blitz. The stiff upper lip wasn't Stoicism achieved. It was Stoicism re-practiced daily, under renewed pressure, by people who were frightened and said so to no one. That's the real lesson buried in the repetition in both the Emperor's notebook and the wartime poster. Composure is not a trophy you win once and keep forever. It is closer to a muscle that atrophies the moment you stop training it. The days you feel like you've got it are usually the days right before you need to relearn it. Marcus Aurelius knew this well enough to write the same reminder to himself dozens of times across a decade, in a war he never got to fully put down. Lesson 3. The notebook was the training, not the output. He wasn't writing a book. He was using writing as a tool to catch his own bad thinking before it became a bad decision affecting an empire. The habit mattered more than any single sentence in it. This distinction matters enormously, and it's the one modern audiences most often get backwards. People read meditations today as though it were a finished philosophical treatise, carefully argued and structured for readers. It isn't. It reads like exactly what it was. A man talking to himself in short bursts, correcting his own irritation at a colleague, reminding himself why anger at other people's stupidity was really a failure to expect stupidity in the first place, working through the same 3 or 4 anxieties in slightly different phrasing, depending on what the day had thrown at him. The value was never in the finished paragraphs. It was in the fact that he sat down and did this consistently for years, whether or not the writing that came out of it was any good. This is the same principle behind the almost obsessive record-keeping practiced by Britain's naval commanders during the Napoleonic Wars. Nelson's signal system, refined from Popham's code, allowed a fleet commander to transmit precise tactical instructions across miles of open water in the middle of a battle. But the signal book itself wasn't the achievement. The achievement was the discipline of drilling officers to read, interpret, and act on those signals instantly, under fire, without hesitation, because the drilling had been repeated so many times that the correct response had become instinct rather than decision. The code was just ink on paper. The training built into using it correctly over and over in conditions of total chaos was the actual weapon. It's the same stiff upper lip again, just wearing a naval uniform instead of a general's coat. Nobody on those decks was told to keep calm and carry on, because calm was their natural state under cannon fire. They were told it, drilled in it, and made to repeat it because the alternative, panic at the moment a signal needed reading, could sink a ship. The composure was manufactured through repetition, the same way Marcus Aurelius manufactured his through the notebook. Marcus Aurelius's notebook worked the same way. The sentences themselves are not particularly sophisticated philosophy. Plenty of Stoic scholars will tell you that as literature, Meditations borrows heavily from Epictetus and offers little that's conceptually new. But that was never the point. The point was that a man responsible for the decisions of an empire had built himself a nightly mechanism for catching his own anger, fear, and self-pity before those emotions were allowed to make a decision on his behalf the following morning. The notebook was the gym. The empire was what he carried out of it. Lesson 4. Private discipline is the only kind that scales. There's one more piece of this worth pulling apart because it's the part most people skip past on their way to the inspirational bit. Marcus Aurelius did not delegate this habit. He didn't have a scribe transcribe his reflections while he dictated grand thoughts for effect. He didn't build an institution around it, the way a modern founder might build a culture of reflection complete with company-wide journaling prompts. It stayed exactly what it started as. One man, one notebook, no witnesses. And that's precisely why it was sustainable across a reign defined by almost constant crises. Anything that requires an audience, a system, or someone else's cooperation to function is fragile. It breaks the moment the audience disappears, the system fails, or the cooperation dries up. A habit that only requires you alone with 10 honest minutes cannot be taken away by circumstance. It can survive a plague. It can survive a war on 2 fronts. It can survive betrayal by people you trusted. Marcus Aurelius's habit survived all three because it never depended on anything outside himself. That's worth remembering the next time you're tempted to build your own self-discipline around an audience. A fitness tracker that shares progress with friends, a public commitment on social media, an accountability partner who has to check in on you. None of those are wrong, but none of them are what Marcus Aurelius was doing either. And none of them will survive the moment the friends stop watching, the platform disappears, or the partner stops checking in. The discipline that actually holds under pressure is the one that needs nothing but you and a closed door. Nearly 2,000 years later, we read meditations as philosophy. Marcus Aurelius never meant it that way. He meant it as a nightly discipline for keeping his own mind honest. The same tool available to anyone with a notebook and 10 honest minutes before bed, empire or no empire. He wasn't writing for us. That's exactly why we're still reading it.